The forest wasn't supposed to feel like this. I mean, I'd been to forests before. Calm, quiet, serene. But there was something about this one. Something that felt alive. Not in the thriving ecosystem kind of way, but in a way that made my skin crawl. It felt like the trees themselves were breathing. Like the wind wasn't just moving. It was whispering, watching. It started with a dare. Isn't that how these things always start? My friends, Eric and Sophie, had found some article about the so-called watching woods on a shady conspiracy website. Apparently, the forest had a reputation for strange disappearances and eerie sightings. Locals avoided it like the plague. But to us, it was perfect. A weekend of hiking, filming, and maybe a little harmless ghost hunting. Eric had this ridiculous plan to record a vlog. Something about debunking the myths and proving the forest was just another spooky urban legend. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but Sophie's enthusiasm was contagious. She had that spark, you know, the kind of energy that could convince you to jump off a cliff just to see what it felt like. We arrived just after midday. The sun was high, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across the dirt path. From the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it. That heavy, unshakable feeling. Like the air was thicker here, harder to breathe. Relax, Eric said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. You're just psyching yourself out. It's just a forest, man. But it wasn't just a forest. We walked for miles, following the worn trail deeper and deeper into the woods. The further we went, the quieter it became. At first, we heard the usual sounds. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But as the hours passed, even those sounds seemed to vanish. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I don't like this, I muttered under my breath, glancing over my shoulder. What's not to like? Sophie teased, her voice too bright for the dim surroundings. It's beautiful. She wasn't wrong. The forest was beautiful in a haunting kind of way. The trees were tall, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers against the sky. Moss clung to their trunks, and the ground was littered with dry leaves that crunched underfoot. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't put into words. Then came the first sign. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, like someone was standing too close. I turned around expecting to see Eric or Sophie behind me, but they were both ahead, chatting and laughing like nothing was wrong. That's when I noticed the silence. Not just the absence of animals, but the absence of sound itself. No footsteps, no voices, no wind. Just nothing. Hey, I called out, my voice shaky. Do you guys feel that? Sophie stopped and turned, a puzzled look on her face. Feel what? The quiet, I said, glancing around. I didn't get to finish my sentence because that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light filtering through the trees. But as I stared, it became clear that it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, standing far off the trail, partially obscured by the trees. Who's that? I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. Eric and Sophie followed my gaze, but when they looked, their expressions didn't change. There's no one there, Eric said, his tone laced with impatience. But there was someone there. I could feel them looking at me, not just looking, staring. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Maybe you should sit down or something, Sophie said, placing a hand on my shoulder. You're probably just tired. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to tell myself that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But as we continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The deeper we went into the forest, the worse it got. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches reaching toward us like they were alive. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shapes that disappeared the moment I turned my head. And that's when I realized the truth. The forest wasn't just watching us, it was waiting. The deeper we went into the forest, the more the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, like we were walking through an invisible fog. It was almost suffocating, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. The others didn't seem to notice, so I kept quiet, hoping the feeling would pass. But it didn't. The trail had all but disappeared now, swallowed by the forest floor. Eric was leading the way, clutching the map like it was some kind of sacred artifact. Sophie was close behind, humming softly to herself. I trailed at the back, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. It felt like we were being followed. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but then I started hearing it. Soft footsteps, barely audible, keeping pace with us. I stopped walking and held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped too. "Guys," I said, my voice low. "Did you hear that?" Eric turned, looking annoyed. "Hear what? You've been jumpy since we got here. Chill out." "I'm serious," I insisted, glancing into the trees. "There's something out there." Sophie frowned, her eyes scanning the forest. "Probably just an animal," she said, but her voice wavered. "Deer or something." It wasn't a deer, I knew it wasn't. We kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches stretching out like claws. The shadows grew darker, deeper, swallowing the faint light that trickled through the canopy. Then we found the markings. They were carved into the trunks of the trees, strange symbols I couldn't make sense of. Circles, jagged lines, and shapes that looked almost like eyes. They were everywhere, covering every tree in sight. "What the hell is this?" Eric muttered, stepping closer to one of the carvings. Sophie reached out to touch one, but I grabbed her hand before she could. "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "Why not?" she asked, pulling her hand away. I didn't have an answer. I just knew it felt wrong, like touching them would invite something we didn't want to meet. "This is getting weird," Sophie said, her voice quieter now. "Maybe we should turn back." Eric scoffed. "Turn back? Are you kidding me? We've barely started." I wanted to argue, but before I could, we heard it. A laugh. It was faint, distant, but it was unmistakable. A low, guttural laugh that sent chills racing down my spine. "What was that?" Sophie whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably the wind," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. We stood there, frozen, listening. The laugh came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't the wind. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. Eric opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of snapping branches cut him off. It came from somewhere to our left, deep in the trees. Then another snap, this time from our right. We weren't alone. Eric finally looked nervous. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should head back." But when we turned to retrace our steps, the trail was gone. I don't mean we lost it. I mean it wasn't there anymore. The path we'd been following had vanished, replaced by an unbroken expanse of trees. "What the—" Eric started, but Sophie cut him off with a sharp gasp. "Look," she said, pointing. At first I didn't see it. Then my eyes adjusted, and I wish they hadn't. Standing between the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and a face I couldn't quite make out. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my throat dry. "See what?" Eric asked, his voice shaking. I turned to look at him, confused. The figure, right there. But when I looked back, it was gone. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "It was there, I swear it was there." Sophie grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." Her voice was laced with panic, and I didn't argue. Eric finally stopped protesting and took the lead, trying to navigate through the maze of trees. But no matter which direction we went, it felt like we were going in circles. The trees all looked the same, their strange carvings staring down at us like eyes. The laughter came again, echoing all around us. It was louder now, closer, as if it was circling us. "We're being hunted," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. And then we saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. In the center of the clearing stood something that shouldn't exist. A massive stone structure, covered in the same strange symbols as the trees. It looked ancient, otherworldly, and it radiated a sense of dread that made my stomach churn. "Don't go near it," I said, but Eric was already moving. "Wait," Sophie called, but he didn't stop. I wanted to follow him, to pull him back, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch as he approached the structure, his hand outstretched. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the world was different. The forest was darker now, as though night had fallen. But there was no moon, no stars, just an oppressive blackness pressing in from all sides. The air was still, too still, and my ears rang with a silence so loud it felt like it was burrowing into my skull. "Eric," I called out, my voice trembling. It barely echoed, swallowed almost instantly by the void around me. "Sophie?" No response. I turned in circles, my breaths coming fast and shallow. The trees seemed closer than before, their twisted branches arching over me like a cage. I couldn't tell which way I'd come from or where to go. Everything looked the same, yet completely alien at the same time. Then I saw the stone structure again. It stood in the distance, glowing faintly with an unnatural light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The strange symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe, shifting and rearranging themselves as I stared. My stomach churned, and I tore my eyes away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to me. "No," I whispered to myself, backing away. "I'm not going near that thing." A sound stopped me in my tracks, a soft, wet drip behind me. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Standing just a few feet away was something. It wasn't Eric or Sophie. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face. God, its face. It was blank, featureless, yet somehow I could feel its gaze piercing through me. It tilted its head, as if curious, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay away," I choked out, though I knew it wouldn't listen. The creature didn't stop. It moved closer, its elongated arms reaching out as if to touch me. And then it smiled. I don't know how it did, but I swear it smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. I ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I sprinted through the forest, my legs burning with every step. I didn't know where I was going. There was no path, no direction, just the primal instinct to get as far away as possible. Behind me, I could hear it following. The sound of its footsteps wasn't loud, but it was constant, relentless. Every time I glanced back, I caught glimpses of it, a pale shape weaving through the trees, its movements impossibly fast and fluid. "Eric! Sophie!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" No answer, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the creature's unyielding pursuit. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the clearing again. The stone structure loomed ahead, its eerie light pulsing faster now, almost like it was alive. And standing at its base was Eric. "Eric!" I yelled, relief flooding through me. But as I got closer, my relief turned to dread. He wasn't moving. His back was to me, his arms hanging limp at his sides. There was something wrong with the way he stood, his body too rigid, too still. "Eric," I said again, more quietly this time. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but before I could, he turned. I stumbled back, a scream catching in my throat. His eyes, if you could even call them that, were black, bottomless voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. His face was pale, his skin stretched tight like the creature's. And when he opened his mouth, the same guttural laugh I'd heard earlier spilled out, echoing through the clearing. "Run," he said, though his lips didn't move. The voice wasn't his. It was deeper, colder, and it vibrated in my skull like nails on a chalkboard. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted back into the forest, the sound of laughter chasing me. It wasn't just one laugh anymore. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, all overlapping, growing louder with every step. I didn't know where Sophie was, if she was even still alive, but I couldn't stop. The trees blurred around me, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing moment. And then I tripped. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for air, too scared to move. When I finally looked up, I saw it again. The creature was standing over me, its head tilted, its blank face inches from mine. Its grin stretched wider, and I could feel its breath, cold and rancid on my skin. I screamed, but before it could reach me, a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me to my feet. "Sophie!" She didn't say a word, just dragged me forward, her grip like iron. Together we ran, the creature's guttural laugh echoing behind us. But something was wrong. The forest was changing. The trees twisted and shifted, their branches reaching out like claws, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to ripple and pulse. It felt like the forest itself was alive, trying to trap us. "We're not going to make it," Sophie cried, her voice breaking. "Yes, we are," I shouted back, though I wasn't sure I believed it. And then, just as the laughter reached a deafening crescendo, we burst through the trees and into the blinding light of the open sky. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, the edge of the forest looming behind us like a black wall. When I turned back, the creature was gone. But the forest wasn't. It stood there, silent and still, watching us. And somehow I knew this wasn't over. We didn't speak for what felt like hours. Sophie and I sat there on the edge of the forest, staring at the tree line, too afraid to look away. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but it brought no comfort. I couldn't stop trembling. My body ached, my throat burned, and my mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask. "Eric?" Sophie finally whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't respond. I couldn't. She turned to me, her face pale, her eyes hollow. "What happened to him?" "I don't know," I said, though the words felt like a lie. I did know. At least I thought I did. Eric was gone. Not dead. No, it was worse than that. The forest had taken him, twisted him into something unrecognizable, something inhuman. I could still hear his voice, the way it had echoed in my mind, warning me to run. "Do you think he's still in there?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. That wasn't Eric. Not anymore. She didn't say anything after that, and I was grateful. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to think about it. All I wanted was to get as far away from this place as possible. But as we sat there, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The forest loomed behind us, dark and silent, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky. It felt alive, almost sentient, like it was waiting for us to make a move. "We need to go," I said, my voice hoarse. Sophie nodded, but she didn't move. She was staring at something on her arm. "What is it?" I asked, leaning closer. She didn't answer, just lifted her sleeve to reveal a mark on her skin, a faint, circular symbol etched into her flesh. My stomach dropped. It was one of the symbols from the trees. "Sophie," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "When did that happen?" "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't touch anything, I swear." Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. "It's fine. I said, though I didn't believe it. "We'll figure it out later. Let's just get out of here." She nodded again, and this time she stood. We started walking, our steps slow and unsteady, putting as much distance as we could between ourselves and the forest. But the further we walked, the heavier Sophie's steps became. "Are you okay?" I asked, glancing at her. She shook her head, her face pale. "I don't feel right," she admitted. I stopped and turned to her, my chest tightening. "What do you mean?" "It's like..." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the forest. "Like it's still in me, watching me." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that we were safe now, but I couldn't, because deep down, I felt it too. The forest wasn't letting us go. Not really. By the time we reached the car, Sophie could barely stand. Her skin was clammy, her breaths shallow, and the mark on her arm seemed darker now, almost black. "Get in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded weakly, and we climbed into the car. I started the engine, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet morning air. As we drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature, or Eric, standing at the edge of the forest watching us. But there was nothing, just the trees, silent and still, fading into the distance. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. Sophie didn't say a word during the drive. She just stared out the window, her eyes glassy and unfocused. I tried to talk to her, to keep her awake, but it was like she couldn't hear me. When we finally reached the edge of town, I pulled into a gas station and parked the car. "Sophie," I said, reaching for her hand. "We're here, we made it." She didn't respond. "Sophie?" Her head turned slowly, and when she looked at me, my heart stopped. Her eyes, her beautiful bright eyes, were gone. In their place were two dark, empty voids, just like Eric's. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." She smiled then, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide. "You shouldn't have left," she said, though it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, colder, and it sent chills racing down my spine. And then she was gone. I blinked, and the passenger seat was empty. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she'd been. My hands were shaking, my mind racing, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I drove home. I don't remember how I got there or how long it took. All I know is that when I walked into my apartment and locked the door behind me, I felt no relief. The forest was still with me. It was in the silence, in the shadows that crept across my walls, in the faint, distant laughter I could hear when everything else was quiet. And as I sat there staring at the mark on my own arm, the same circular symbol Sophie had, I realized the truth. The forest doesn't let you go. Not really.